And class is in session. You're listening to Shit Shooting 101. I'm your host, Joshua Lee. Joining us today, a comparative cosmologist, author of such books as Point of Origin, The Cosmological Origins of Myth and Symbol, Sacred Symbols of the Dogon, Primal Wisdom of the Ancients, as well as various other most fascinating, elucidating, enlightening works of sheer brilliance. Here to connect the dots, draw the lines, and bridge the gaps of the ancient mysteries, wiping our glasses squeaky clean for a new look at time and cosmogony, a brain-tickling, mind-boggling, thought-provoking wizard of symbols, bringing words to the wise and wisdom to the words. It's Laird Scranton. Laird, welcome back to the show.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me on today. I've been looking forward to this all week.
It's been quite some time since I had you on the podcast, and quite frankly, I needed that break to relax my brain muscles after that discussion. This time I brought my stilts, so hopefully nothing will be going over my head like it was last time. Maybe I'll need some tiptoes on those stilts to get just a little bit high enough so that it doesn't go over my head. But last time, what we discussed was the Dogon tribe of Africa and some of their advanced wisdoms, ancient advanced wisdoms that surpasses even a lot of our modern sciences of today. And you explained how they described where they received that information was from these entities. And every time I've heard you describe them, you don't say that they're metaphysical, you say that they're non-material. And I would like you to, expound upon that, because it's hard to understand for me how anybody would experience us being material beings. We experience the world through our five senses, which are all based physically, corporeal and materialistically. So us being that type of being, how do we even experience the non-material or receive information from it?
Okay, that's a tricky question. I'll try to get at sort of indirectly. Okay, we know that, boy, this is a tough question. What it all comes down to is how energy works, the cycle of how energy works. We know that when scientists talk about energy, they very often use metaphors that relate to water. Pretty much everything that water does, energy does. In fact, the Dogons say that water provides us with a pattern for what energy does. So if we look at deep sea domains of water, in the deepest parts of the ocean, we realize that what naturally occurs is that water self-differentiates into biological zones. And there are different styles of life forms that prefer to live in different ones of those zones, depending on what temperature they like, or how much sunlight they need, or what water pressure they prefer. So you have creatures that live along the bottom of the ocean that might not have any concept that creatures swim at the top, at the surface. And you have certain creatures like whales that don't care about the zones. They can dive down through any zone they want and swim right back up. So energy, according to the Hinduist, Buddhist, and Dogon concepts, energy does the same thing. That energy naturally differentiates into zones. And it does so, the divisions between these zones are the resonance points in the energy, the same way that the musical notes on a scale are the resonant points of vibrating sound. And so the idea is that life of various varieties exists in each of these domains and experience things according to their own limitations. Rene Guénon, who's an authority on Hinduism, says that consciousness works that same way, that there are levels of consciousness of which we're just sort of the piece that sits above the surface of the water, so to speak. But that there are other self-differentiated domains of consciousness that exist conceptually prior to ours. Now, transitions are based on what science calls phase transition. Water freezes into ice naturally. When we drop the temperature far enough, water will freeze into ice. If you raise the temperature more, liquid water will become vapor. Energy is the same way. So what both the Buddhists and the Dogon flatly claim that they received their information from a non-material source. But the Dogon go a step further. They say not only was it non-material, originally it was energetic. It wasn't a material form. But that energetic consciousness found a way to take material form and interact with people face to face. Well, if we understand that, this again is a complex explanation. There's a cycle of energy, according to the Dogon, that works a little bit like an hourglass, where you start with all of the sand up in the top globe of the hourglass, and slowly the sand sifts downward into the bottom globe. With energy, these traditions that I'm researching rest on a philosophy called Samkhya that was first expressed in India. It's a companion to yoga. And Samkhya says that universes form in pairs, like the two globes of that hourglass, and that there's a natural cycle of energy that scrolls from one to the other and then back again. But you're not just scrolling energy, you're also scrolling mass. And Einstein says, if we increase mass, we slow time. And so you have a cycle going on of energy moving from one domain to the other, making one less material and making the other one more material. And at the same time, shifting the pace of time in both of those domains. Time is quickening in the non-material domain, and it's slowing down in the material domain. Now, at the midpoint of that cycle, when you have just as much sand in the top hourglass as you have in the bottom hourglass, the time frames equalize the same way water pressure equalizes with an airlock. The way that an astronaut can move into outer space is by stepping into the airlock, equalizing the air pressure inside with what it is outside, and then they can safely step out into space. Same thing with a submarine. So the Dogon perspective is that at the midpoint of this energetic cycle, time frames match the same way that water pressure matches or air pressure matches. And at that point, it's possible for conscious entities that are on the other side of that segment or domain of energy can move across. As a matter of fact, the ancient Egyptians used symbols to represent these domains, and the symbol that represents the one that just precedes ours is the picture of a gateway. It's an upside down U. The idea is that in certain eras, there is more compatibility between the domains. It really boils down to a comparison to water pressure. So the Dogon is saying that a group of originally non-material teachers took it upon themselves to try to instruct humanity in their little tribal groups globally in ancient times. They were basically instructing two things. They were providing a civilizing plan that was focused on agriculture, skills of agriculture, and that tagged to a cosmology, a symbolic creation tradition that was scientific in nature. The Dogon say that their symbols describe how matter forms. It's very easy for someone like you or me to see that their description of an atom is correct and that they have the correct descriptions of electrons and protons. And they actually provide a drawing to support that is a reasonable representation of an electron orbit. But they also have a long descending set of structures that support all of that I couldn't help but wonder if it might, those also might not be scientific. And so I started educating myself and sort of took it step by step to see, is there a perspective from which what the Dogon are saying as they move down that chain could be reasonable scientifically? And it turns out it all is.
Sticking with the theme of water, perhaps, if we think of ourselves in the material realm as being the ice and these non-material beings perhaps as heat, and they act upon water to create a vapor, we would recognize the vapor because we are made of that water stuff. And so we're recognizing this non-material being through the material that they're acting upon. Does that make any sense?
It's sort of, I'll try to give you a better example of how it actually works. The Dogon are talking about domains that are superimposed with each other. The same way that if you look down through the deep body of seawater, you're not seeing a series of sequential domains. You're witnessing activity going on simultaneously in all the domains with cross interaction between them. That what some of the creatures in that deep seawater do affects what the ones in the middle, what's going on for the ones in the middle. A similar comparison is made to the electromagnetic spectrum, where what started out as gamma rays at the time of the Big Bang, we now measure as microwaves, which are much, much longer wavelength. We're affected by every frequency of energy along that scale, not just one of them. And we can think of them as being sequential, but there are also perspectives from which we have to think of them as one whole thing. This is a concept called quantum coherence. It's one of the biologists I study compares it to the action of a jazz combo, that every musician in the jazz combo has ultimate freedom to do, to play what they want, but it's got to be in harmony with the theme of the piece that they're all playing together. And she says biologically that's the way energy works, that every individual action that's combining to produce life is happening on an individualized scale, but it's also in the context of a broader scale of energy that governs the entire biological entity. And so the universe is seen that way. Consciousness is seen that way. Consciousness is the ability to take a thing and break it down into its component parts conceptually, and then put it back together conceptually. In other words, it's the ability to see a thing in overview, but also to examine it in detail. And that's exactly what quantum coherence is. And that's what the Dogons say these domains of energy are. They all exist simultaneously, but there's also a perspective from which we understand them sequentially.
You've spoken about these learning centers around the world anciently, such as Gobekli Tepe and Orkney Island, and they're all over the globe at that time period. And so my question is, the teachers at these sites, how were they traveling to these areas? Were they traveling physically, interdimensionally, or was it some kind of universal psychic phenomenon at that time period?
Okay, the Dogon are describing physical instruction. As a matter of fact, they say that their teachers were concerned about what the bad effects might be on us of being around them being energetic beings and us being material, body, flesh and blood beings. So they're talking about direct interaction, direct contact, not just shamanic mental contact that someone physically was trying to teach us. Now, one of the ways that their teachers limited those bad effects was by sequestering a group of 8 students from each tribal group, taking them to a remote location, giving them instruction there, and then sending them back to teach everybody else. We can see the first evidence of the symbols that are associated with this tradition at around 9,000 BC at Gobekli Tepe, in the region of Gobekli Tepe. The period of instruction the Dogon are most directly speak about seems to have happened around 3,200 BC on Orkney Island, north of Scotland, where all the first megalithic structures in the United Kingdom were set out, and where very interesting things were going on according to the BBC, and no one's quite sure what they were. But we can tie clusters of elements from Orkney Island that were founding elements on Orkney to a tradition that moved across the Mediterranean. It started at Gobekli Tepe, and from a period of about 6,000 BC forward, it looks like there was deliberate colonization of the major islands of the Mediterranean for agriculture. And hand in hand with each other are these clusters, the set of symbols that define the cosmology, a set of agricultural elements, including domesticated animals and domesticated plants. There are architectural elements that travel together. There are cultural elements like burial traditions. There are linguistic elements, common words that are being used. So the mistake that researchers make, in my opinion, in trying to track where the Orkney Island farmers came from around 3600 BC, is that they'll pick one element at a time. They'll say, okay, we know that this breed of sheep was domesticated in the region of the Near East, the Gobekli Tepe region, at around by around 6,000 BC. But we have no idea how it got here, because it might have come by any possible path. It might have come across land, it might have come by sea, it might have come in slow increments. We don't know how it arrived here, so we can't say who brought it here. The proper approach from my point of view is to focus on the founding clusters of elements, because those can be tracked together. And then you don't have any question of how it made its way to Orkney, because they left a trail across the Mediterranean, out Gibraltar, up the coast of Europe, through the Hebrides to Orkney by around 3600 BC.
Have you found evidence that the ancient adepts were able to tap into the non-material intelligences for technological designs, as far as tools, machinery, or even vehicular devices?
No, we're talking about scientific concepts. We're not talking about application of science, for the most part. Now, that's not to say that we don't have artifacts that look very seriously scientific, that go way back. But the cultures that I'm studying are passing along scientific principles and scientific concepts. We're not saying that the Dogon are inventing telescopes with that. They know the importance of the information, and their societal mission is to preserve the symbolism in its original form, to preserve language in its original form. The reason that's important is because prior to around 500 BC, words explained their own meanings to us in various languages. That at 500 BC, Confucius in China was very concerned, because he could see that the Chinese language was starting to no longer do that. You couldn't count on a Chinese word to explain its own meaning to you. The way the Dogon words do that is, the Dogon language is founded on syllables that are very carefully defined. Each syllable represents a root concept. And then they create a more complicated word by combining two or more syllables. And you know the meaning of the word just by substituting concepts for the root syllables. And so if I know how a Dogon or a Maori word was pronounced, I have a pretty good idea of what it was meant to represent originally. You go to the Egyptian hieroglyphic language, and the same thing happens now, not just in terms of phonetics, but also in terms of the glyphs that are used to write the words, that each individual glyph represents a concept. And if you substitute concepts for glyphs, you produce a sentence that explains to you what meaning the scribe was trying to express when they wrote the word. And we don't have to guess what that meaning was. You even have certain Egyptian words whose role is to define the meaning of certain glyphs. So you don't have to guess what the glyphs represent. One of the projects I've been working on sort of in the background is developing a list of Egyptian glyphs in derived sequence, meaning that the goal is to express the meaning of each next glyph only using glyphs that had already been predefined, to never use a glyph that I haven't already explained. How do we know what it means? And sort of evolve a whole lexicon of ancient Egyptian glyphs that mean certain things because the glyphs they're written with mean certain things.
You mentioned China, and in the Western world, historically, we think of China as being this isolated place, completely cut off from the rest of the world, with their traditions, their culture, their language. But what you've investigated, that isn't entirely true as when you go back anciently. How do they connect to the rest of the ancient world, especially the Dogon in ancient Egypt?
Well, one of the meanings of Gobekli Tepe, okay, ancient words carry clusters of meanings. The word tepe in the modern Turkish language has 25 meanings. So there's debate as to how to translate the name Gobekli Tepe, because you have multiple sets of meanings you can choose from. But one of the possible translations means central hill. That's the same meaning that applies to the Greek suffix opolis. The Greeks used to establish their temples on hillsides that were centrally located. So if you look at a map of the world, you'll see that southeastern Turkey is very centrally located to a lot of different ancient cultures. And China is as equally as close to Gobekli Tepe as Egypt is. So what's indicated is that many different groups were educated at Gobekli Tepe and then sent back to their homelands to teach everybody else. That's one of Jung's archetypes.
Oh, your volume cut out, Laird. Laird, your volume cut out. Oh, you're froze up entirely now. You there?
We can demonstrate intuitively
that
China connects to the same tradition. There's a very easy proof of that. There's an ancient Egyptian word that expresses the idea of a week. The Egyptians celebrated a 10-day week. They observed a 10-day week. And the word for week is written with two glyphs. It's a circle with a dot in the middle of it, which is the sun glyph that can represent the concept of a day, and an upside down U, which is the number 10. In other words, the form of the word itself says 10 days, which is the definition of a week. If you go to ancient China with their early hieroglyphic language, they also observed a 10-day week, and they wrote the word the same way. They used a circle with a dot in the middle of it that represented the concept of a day, and they combined that with their number 10 to produce the word week. So we have fundamental comparability between the earliest symbolic language in China and the earliest symbolic written language in Egypt. This is eye-to-eye stuff. You go to China and there are problems trying to study China because events that occurred around 3000 BC didn't get written down until around 300 BC. And so you have all sorts of debate among scholars as to what the truth is and what was made up in between, and what was someone's impression and what was the actual truth of things. But you can find the trail of the same symbology the Dogon observed and that many other cultures observe, all the same themes, many of the same myths, many of the same words and phonetics applied to the same concepts, many of the same symbols. It's all the same stuff.
So is there any understanding as to why they had a 10-day week as opposed to the 7-day week?
Well, yeah, actually, symbolically, that connects back to the divisions of energy I was talking about. That each domain of energy, the Dogon are talking about 14 domains of energy that exist simultaneously. But they're differentiated by a difference in pace of time. The same way that deep sea water biological zones are differentiated by a shift in water pressure, the energetic domains are differentiated by a shift in the pace of time, and those are in factors of 10. In fact, the scientists, when they represent the electromagnetic spectrum, divide it up into segments based on factors of 10, and those float. They illustrate what the Dogon are talking about. The scientists don't realize that, but I had followed all of the Dogon and Egyptian references and realized that that's how they conceptualize things. And then picked up on the fact that the electromagnetic spectrum, as I said, diagrams that for us in factors of 10. So the idea of adopting a 10-day week is that it's symbolic of those 10-day segments that define energy, 10 factors of 10 segments.
They say that all roads lead through Egypt, and my road here next year hopefully will be leading to Egypt. So to somebody like me, what would you say that I should definitely be on the lookout for as far as to experience the most enlightening, education into my human origins?
Okay, well, the key to any visit to Egypt is going to be finding a guide who knows what they're talking about, to go with a group and led by a guide who has an overview of ancient Egyptian history and symbology and a knowledge of the temples and so forth. For my purposes, Egypt is a little bit late. Or the Orkney tradition was began nearly 1,000 years before dynastic Egypt, and many of the early sites in Egypt, ancient Egypt, seem to have been established sort of in nostalgia for Orkney. When they established the first dynasty in Egypt, there was a cemetery put in place at Abydos, overlooking two mountains with a mountain pass, a gap between the two mountains. The word Abydos is based on an Egyptian word Abdu, according to Seti, and the word Abdu means the desired mountain. If you go to Orkney, you see that these megalithic structures that were built on Orkney, including what looks like an ancient school, was set in direct view of a similar set of mountains, two mountains that are shaped like elephants, or imagined to be shaped like elephants, with a gap in between. And there's a reason for that. It's because the energetics we're talking about come down to the dynamics of two energies, magnetism and electricity. And the key aspect of magnetism is that it oscillates back and forth the same way that seasons of a year oscillate or the sun oscillates over the course of the year from solstice to equinox to solstice and back again. Well, you have that dynamic of energy illustrated on Orkney Island in connection with a second dynamic, that linear dynamic that is sunrise to sunset. And so on Orkney, what you have is it's situated in a place where the sun rises in the east and it sets in the west behind those two mountains with a gap in between. And on the equinox, the sun sits squarely between the two mountains. And so sunset behind those mountains gives you visibility to the annual oscillation of the sun back and forth. And the sunrise sunset dynamic gives you visualization of the second dynamic, which is, linear. Those correspond to two modes of time, which is why quantum coherence comes about, because you have one mode of time that is essentially evaluating everything in the overview, and a second mode of time that's evaluating everything linearly. And so consciousness for a human, to my way of understanding, is the ability to interpret anything we encounter in terms of either of those energies, that we can look at it in terms of magnetism and see it in an overview, or we can look at it in terms of electricity and examine it stage by stage. So Egypt is a little bit late for my purposes. If you really want the pure form of what was represented in Egypt, you go to Orkney. It's just harder to pick up on it on Orkney because there are very few people who understand how the different segments of the society connect. In Egypt, you can scarcely move without tripping over a pot, an ancient artifact of some kind. On Orkney, there is very, very little evidence to work from. And so it takes a lot more deeper introspection to understand what was going on in Orkney than in Egypt. The earliest burial chambers in Egypt were built according to the same plan as the earliest houses on Orkney. And ancient Egyptian Egyptologists understand that burial chambers in Egypt were meant to represent houses.
So, how can you be sure that Orkney preceded Egypt when there's so much debate as far as how far back Egypt goes? I mean, pre-dynastic.
Okay. We're judging by a set of common elements. Okay, there was a change in culture in Egypt that happened around the pre-dynastic dynastic boundary sometime around 3000 BC. But that followed Orkney, or the heyday of Orkney started sometime after 4000 BC, probably closer to 3600 BC, and extended through around 2600 BC. So everything about dynastic Egypt is situated at least centuries, if not a millennium later than what happened on Orkney.
That's interesting.
You go prior to that in Egypt, and you don't have the connections of words, and you don't have the connections of symbolic forms. You don't have the connections of architecture. All those clusters of elements I was citing before that moved across the Mediterranean. You don't have those connections if you move prior to dynastic Egypt.
Okay, so this next question is going to come out of left field. It's one of those childish curiosities. When I was a kid, I was told that the universe is infinite, and I tried to imagine it, but of course I could not, because I'm thinking, well, it has to end somewhere. But then when I think of the ending, what's beyond that ending? More universe. So where does that more universe end? And then that ending, there must be something beyond it. So it seems like it has to end, but it can't end. It has to be infinite, but it can't be infinite. And then you look to the ancients, and they describe the universe symbolically as a snake eating its own tail. And that creates this loop that gives me some understanding, I guess. And it's inside of itself, but also at the same time outside of itself. And so my mind took it a bit further, and I thought, well, what if that universe is not only devouring itself, but simultaneously regurgitating itself? Maybe there's some sort of where it's turning inside out, outside in at the same time, simultaneously creating this kind of unseeable pulse, fluctuating of, inward, outward, outward, inward, that would create all these quantum effects. I know that's kind of weird as far as the topics we've been covering, but I thought if there's anybody that has something to say about that, that would be Laird.
No, that's definitely on point in an odd way. Okay, we understand about the concept of cycles, and especially because there's comparison to water, we understand the natural water cycle. The natural water cycle is perpetual in the same way that you feel that the universe, the energy of the universe is perpetual, that we move from, the natural water cycle is the idea that water evaporates from the seas or from bodies of water. It produces clouds of water vapor that rise up over the mountains, and then cooling of temperature causes the water to condense into raindrops that fall to the earth and then flow back to the sea and streams and rivers and collects again in the oceans and the lakes. That cycle is a perpetual cycle. And if we only look at the cycle, we would be in the same dilemma you're in about the universe, which is there's no start or end to the cycle. You can't point to water vapor and say it starts here. You can't point to liquid water and say it starts here. But any thinking person understands that that cycle couldn't exist without the formation of water molecules first. And what the formation of water molecules isn't part of that cycle. And until you have the water molecules, the cycle can't be put in motion. So we know intellectually that what preceded the natural water cycle was the formation of water molecules. That means the natural water cycle is not infinite perpetual. It just seems that way to us. And that before the natural water cycle started, we had molecules of water. Exactly the same logic applies to energy, the cycle of energy in the universe. The Dogon used the natural water cycle seemingly as a metaphor to explain what happens with energy, but when you get down to the bottom of it, you realize it's not a metaphor at all. They're speaking literally about what happens with energy. Energy has the same stages of evaporation, of condensation, and of collecting of back together that water does. Actually correlates to water, droplets of water, raindrops, correlates to liquid water. Scientists use liquid water as a metaphor all the time to illustrate what energy does. That all of the key terms that relate to electricity have water definitions. You're talking about the flow of electricity through a wire. Anything that happens to electricity also happens to water. So to get outside of our own head into understanding that cycle, we understand that the cycle could potentially, not only could potentially start someplace, but necessarily must have started someplace. And we know what that someplace looks like because of what the water cycle's someplace looks like. It starts with water, something equivalent to water molecules. And my previous book, the last book I published, is called Amma and the Spark of the Universe. The purpose of that book, the thrust of that book, is to trace how you get from a domain of pure energy to an atom, essentially, in a scientifically reasonable way, based on what the ancient cultures tell us is going on. This next volume that I'm about to publish, sometime before the end of this year, hopefully, will be called The Waters of Life. And it does the same thing for energy, but it's doing it in terms of biology. It's demonstrating how do we get from the same domain of pure energy, using the same dynamics of energy, and produce a biological cell. How is it that a biological cell functions in relation to the same dynamics of energy that we've talked about that form matter? And the Dogons say consciousness works the same way. Ultimately, I expect there'll be a volume where I do the same tracing from the root domain of energy to how consciousness manifests itself. Essentially, the idea is that the potential for matter, for life, and for consciousness is all built right into the dynamics of those energies. The same way it's sort of an interdependent process, the same way that bread rises as yeast grows within the bread. You can't ask yourself which happens first. Does the yeast grow or does the bread rise? The two happen simultaneously. They're interlinked processes. And magnetism and electricity are the same way. You have an interlinking of two energies, and the dynamics of those energies is what is necessary to get us to matter, to consciousness, and to life. So it's not a matter of the worm eating its tail is a way of representing the concept of a cycle. The whole thrust of the ancient mindset, the whole symbolic mindset, is to reduce fractions. Because when you reduce fractions, you make things easier to understand. You can have, the outlook is that a single cluster of dynamics of energy are at work on every scale, up all the way up the scale. It doesn't matter where you look at it, whether you're looking at atoms or whether you're looking at the quantum domain, whether you're looking at solar systems, that whether you're looking at a body of water, that the dynamics of energy that are responsible for what happens are the same all the way up the scale. Now, we can take a lower dimensional view of those dynamics and everything simplifies. When you get down to the bottom of it, when you take the lowest dimensional view of what happens with these energetics, you only have one candidate for what could cause space to expand, and you only have one candidate for what could cause gravity to happen. When you shift your view up the dimensional scale, you get to the level of 3 dimensions. Suddenly you have all sorts of nuance of understanding how those interactions happen that you don't get with a one-dimensional view. And so there are advantages to looking at it at from different perspectives. In fact, the Dogon, when they provide us with a drawing, they will identify that drawing with one of 4 dimensional perspectives to let us know what we're seeing. And in some cases, they give us more than one dimensional perspective on the same thing. So we have a comparative to know, okay, if you're looking at it from a 3-dimensional point of view, here's what it looks like. If you're looking at it from a 2-dimensional point of view, here's what it looks like. So simply reducing fractions and simplifying the outlook is the way to grasp the thing. The Dogon are saying math is entirely the wrong tool to use as your primary tool in trying to understand this stuff. Math is a good tool for validating certain things. The problem is that if you look out into the distance, watch a road extend out into the distance, and you use math to evaluate that, you're going to arrive at a singularity. You're going to arrive at a number that you can't work with because it's a singularity. Or if you go on you end up either with a divide by 0 or you end up with infinity as an answer, which is not a workable number. So the Dogon are saying if you really wanted to understand what happens here, you can't work quantitatively. You have to work qualitatively. You have to understand how the dynamics are working and then use the math to amplify that. But the math is going to break down before you get to the bottom of what's going on. Essentially, the smallest length that we can measure, given the time frame, the pace of time that we live in, is called the Planck length. And from the Dogon and Egyptian perspective, the quantum domain where the Planck length is measured, the pace of time runs 10,000 times more quickly than it does for us. But you trace things back as far as the Big Bang, and we're talking about a pace of time that looks like it's 1,000,000 times quicker than what we experience. And so if the smallest length we can measure is 10,000 times quicker than what we experience, we don't have a prayer of using math to figure things out at 1,000,000 times quicker than what we experience. Everything looks random when it's not. If I'm measuring with yardsticks, but the events are occurring in millimeters, then any result that happens is going to look random to me, even though it's not.
Speaking of yardsticks, the way that they measured to be able to build some of these ancient structures, we have the ancient cubit, and they describe that as being from the fingertip to the elbow. And what I never understood how they could, how that could be possible. I mean, everybody's length of arm is different, and that would create just a mess of a hodgepodge of measurements all over the place, I would assume. So what were they actually measuring by?
Okay. A.E. Berriman wrote a book called Historical Metrology, where he lists the cubit lengths of a whole range of different ancient cultures, and they're all different lengths. Nothing in this symbolic system was done without reason. And so part of what they're trying to do is get us to question our assumptions. Now, perhaps the most fundamental assumption of science is that the pace of time is constant and that distance is constant. But the symbolic language is telling us, the symbols used to write certain Egyptian words and phonetics used to write Dogon words or to express Dogon words are flatly telling us not to trust that we need to consider what happens if those units of measure are variable. And by selecting a cubit as a unit of measure where each person measures a different length, a cubit is defined as either the distance from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger or as the average pace or step of a person. But in Buddhism, they're using the cubit to measure out a set of geometrical figures that are used to align a stupa shrine to the north, south, east, and west. And the effect works not based on what size the figures are, but the relationship of them. That it makes no difference whatsoever what precise size they are. It only makes a difference what their relationship is to each other. And so the idea, science has gotten it in its head that with ever more precise measurements, we're going to get to the answer here. And the ancients are saying that's not at all true until you understand that your yardstick is changing underneath you. You know, while you sleep, someone's coming in and changing all the distances and all the duration of moments and so forth. And it's transparent to us because as long as they're in proportion with each other, we don't notice it. I'll try to give you an example of why that works. Imagine that we're objective observers, able to see things from the outside. We're not affected by what happens in the universe. And we can measure during the length of an objective moment how far light extends. Light travels at a constant pace. So if we know how long that moment is objectively, we know how far light extends. Now imagine that because of increases in mass, suddenly that objective moment defines double the duration that it used to define. What would happen is that light would then extend twice as far as it had in the previous objective moment that we knew. And so if you double the length of time and you double the extension of light, it becomes indistinguishable to us from space expanding. That from our perspective, all the factors we measure by look like space expands. There's an important Egyptian concept of truth called Mat. It's a complicated concept that is sometimes defined as a sense of justice or a sense of truth or of correctness. It was the responsibility of the pharaoh to maintain Mat in Egyptian society. But when you look at the glyphs to write the Egyptian word, what the glyphs say is perception is the foundation of measure. It's a caution, it's a warning. Be aware that your perception is the foundation of what you measure. And so you can't count on what you measure if what you're perceiving changes. There was a famous anthropological case where a tribe, someone came across a tribal group on an island that had only ever lived within the confines of a valley, a very close valley. And so the anthropologists, for the first time, took a group of these tribal people outside of the valley, and the tribesmen could see in the distance a row of sheep along a ridge. And no one could convince them that they weren't tiny sheep, because to their conceptual framework, distance wasn't a thing. They didn't understand that if you extend the distance, the thing looks smaller. They couldn't understand they had full-size, regular-size sheep sitting on a ridge, but it was so far away that it looks smaller. And that's precisely what's happening energetically in the universe, that we're not allowing for the fact that shifts in the pace of time that should accompany shifts in mass are affecting our measures. That the scientists, right there, every week or so I see a report saying, well, we've done the math and we calculated that way back during the first few million years after the Big Bang, the galaxies formed much more quickly than they should be capable of forming. We don't understand it, that they can't possibly form that quickly. How did they do that? Well, they don't grasp that. They're looking back into time as they look out into space, and that with time, the mass of the universe has been increasing. As a matter of fact, in the same time that it took the universe to double in volume, the ratio of mass to energy also doubled. There's a one-to-one correspondence between the increase in mass and the apparent expansion of space. And so when they look at these early galaxies forming, they're not factoring in the situation that time ran at a much quicker pace then than it does now. Those galaxies formed at the very same pace they do now. Time itself ran quicker. And they should know that because they understand that a decrease in mass should mean an increase in the pace of time. Einstein tells us.
So, traveling back to Asia, the god Ganesha is one of those deities who the average mind sees and quickly disregards as just another strange myth with the head of an elephant. What are the deeper meanings behind Ganesha? What is its symbolism really telling us?
Okay, we have direct relationship conceptually and in some cases in terms of individual terms and words that are used to describe the cosmology for the Dogon and the iconic symbolism of Ganesha. In the end, if we examine that, I wrote an entire book about it. It's called Ganesha, the Scientific Symbolism of a Hindu God. From the Dogon perspective, what they're describing are some basic dynamics of energy. What happens with energy is that when two qualities of energy come together, they tend to spin around a center. And as they spin, they foster resonance and resistance, which is mass. And eventually that resistance builds up to a point where it has to be relieved. The same way that a snowplow pushing snow forward reaches a point where there's too much snow in front of the snowplow and now it gets ejected out to the sides of the snowplow perpendicularly to the motion of the snowplow. The same thing happens with energy as it spins. That resistance builds to a point where eventually vectors of energy are ejected from the spinning energy, perpendicular to the plane of the spin of the energy. Ganesha's symbolism is rooted specifically in those dynamics, that those vectors of energies that get emitted because spinning energy is increasing mass as it spins, you have a pace of time that is also slowing down as it spins. And those vectors extend further and further out as time goes on because you have a slower pace of time. And the factor I was talking about with light being able to extend further if you slowed down the pace of time is causing those vectors to extend. And so the Dogons say that if you take a higher dimensional view of that, you don't see the vectors, you see a spiral of energy, because the spiral that that inscribes the endpoints of those rays of energy. Hinduism has a concept of a world spiral. The Dogon also have the same concept of a world egg or a world spiral. If you go to Sanskrit, there's a title of Ganesha, Ganapati, which, based on Sanskrit roots, they interpret to mean Lord of the Ganas, which is sort of unspecific. However, if you interpret the Sanskrit term using the Dogon syllables, what Ganapati literally means is world spiral. So the title of Ganesha, if you look at it from the perspective of ancient cosmological syllables, represents the world spiral. Now, the Dogon references are so specific that I was able to actually infer from the Dogon references that a concept of a female Ganesha must have existed in ancient times, and the relationship of the female Ganesha to the male Ganesha is an embrace. This is effectively symbolizing what happens with the two energies, magnetism and electricity. And so I set off to discover in traditions in India whether there was any reference to a female Ganesha in an embrace with the male Ganesha. And I eventually found some clues that it might have existed, but I could find no objective reference to it in India. Then I moved on to China, and I discovered a list of specifications that if you wanted to build a little figure to represent it, here's the material you have to make it out of, and how high it should be, and what features the two elephants should have, and what position they should be in relation to each other, and so on. But I also discovered that at 1100 AD, this concept was so highly secretive that at 1100 AD, an emperor in China banned it from inclusion in any volume on Buddhism. No one could mention it anymore. The figures themselves were so secretive that they could only allowed to be housed in portable shrines that could be moved on a moment's notice. There's such a shrine exists outside of Tokyo that's dedicated to these hugging Ganeshas. The concept survived in Shingon Buddhism, which is in Japan. And my wife actually came across a properly made brass figure of the two elephants, which she she ordered from India, and 3 days later it turned up at our house. It was supposed to take 6 to 8 weeks to get there. Ganesha's symbolism is inherently about those dynamics of spinning energy, which is the cluster of dynamics that everything depends on. If you understand how those work, it doesn't matter whether you examine it at the level of quantum energy or whether you examine it at the level of a hydrogen atom or at the level of stars in the universe. It's all the same dynamics. If you understand how the dynamics work, you can put your finger on why the things happen that happen.
Was there any kind of turning point or some sort of shift that you can point to as to why they decided that symbolism was to be banned and occulted so heavily?
No, I don't know what induced the emperor in China to ban it. I know it was treated as secretive, and maybe he decided that the best way to keep it secret was to not allow anybody to talk about it.
All right.
But you can get down to pretty specific things about the symbolism of Ganesha, examining those dynamics of energy and examining the Sanskrit and related words that pertain to it. But in Hinduism, Sanskrit has moved away from the cosmological syllables that explain the meanings of words. If you take the names of traditional Hindu deities like Sati, who is Ganesha's mother, and interpret them instead using the Dogon symbols, then the symbolism of the god or the goddess plays right out. It's directly expressed by the Dogon symbols what that deity was supposed to represent. And we understand, because in the Dogon system, there's no attempt to represent this as deities. They're talking about stages and concepts of energy, creational energy. And they can use a symbol. They can use a symbol like a picture of a rabbit or the concept of a rabbit to represent the concept of vibrations, because a rabbit twitches. And so there's an intuitive connection between the notion of vibration and a rabbit. But when it comes to dynamics of energy, how energy accomplishes things when it's in motion, that's not easily described using a symbol or using an icon. In order to describe that, you really need a storyline. And so what they do is they take the concepts that are involved and anthropomorphize those, and then let the characters in the myth do what the energy does. And if the names of the characters tell you what concept is anthropomorphized, so this isn't even rocket science to try to figure out what they're talking about. There's nothing, everything is hidden in plain view. There's nothing that's actually hidden. No attempt to even hide anything. But it's a matter of us catching on to the fact that, they're flatly telling us how all this stuff works. All we have to do is look at it.
Are the Dogon still receiving information from the non-material intelligences? Do you believe some of these ancient sites, the learning centers, are still activated by the energies? Are those portals still open, or is that well ran dry?
The Yuga cycle defines a cycle of energy that moves our material domain closer to and then farther away from the ability to perceive things that are not material. But it never moves us entirely out of range of being able to perceive it. The comparison is to if you were taking a cross-country trip and before you left your hometown, you set your car radio to your favorite station, you would reach a point where that station would fade out and maybe another station would fade in, but on the same frequency. But with the energetic cycle, even at the extremes of the cycle, which is we're at just past one of the extremes recently, from my point of view, humanity effectively is not able to perceive non-materiality. But the truth of the matter is that some people can in certain ways, and there's communication that happens through, according to Samkhya, through vivid dreams, through synchronicities, through the unusual behavior of animals. Um, there are through clairvoyance, through divination, that there is clear indication that there is still a connection. It's just such a weak connection that your average person, for the average person, it's as if it doesn't exist. And unfortunately, most scientists are not friendly to the idea of things that don't exist that they can't directly perceive and measure. That's one of the blind spots for the scientific community. If I was teaching you to drive a car, and I never explained to you that the way the mirrors are positioned in the car, it creates a blind spot that's big enough to hide a tractor trailer truck. You might go through your entire driving career imagining that looking at those mirrors, you're seeing everything around you. But the truth of the matter is you're not. There's a place there where things can hide that you can't see given the system of measures you're using to look at it. And that's one of the faults I see with science, is that science has set up a set of structures that disallow certain things from being real. That science doesn't allow that if a thing happens once and can't be replicated, that it's real. But there might very well be a class of things that happen once and can't be replicated on demand that are entirely real.
Yeah, consciousness and thinking, that's one of those areas that science tries to explain but has a complete blind spot over. So speaking about dreams, when we look at dreams today, people try to pass it off as it was just something you ate or something you thought of earlier but suppressed. Or scientifically, they may say that there's neuronal pruning going on. There's your brain is strengthening certain synapses, causing neuronal firing in certain areas of the brain, which produces imagery, blah, blah, blah. But it doesn't explain away a lot of these things we experience in dreams, such as, maybe you find the answer, the solution to a problem that you couldn't figure out during your waking hours, or maybe you have psychic dreams, or maybe you astral project. And a lot of the science doesn't explain anything that's going on in dreams whatsoever. So how do the ancients perceive dreams? Is it some sort of lost technology that we've forgotten how to use?
That's also a complicated question. Okay, I explained to you that ancient words, especially cosmological words, carry clusters of meanings. And these meanings are discrete meanings, so that if I know one of the meanings, it doesn't enable me to reasonably guess what the other meanings are. They're discrete from each other. That there may not be any obvious connection between the meanings. So dreams, vivid dreams, play out in the same mode. That on many occasions, when a person has explained to me that they had a vivid dream and they're able to describe for me what the key elements of the dream were and what the feelings were they had during the dream and what words might have been spoken during the dream, what images they saw, what places they went, what actions did they take, I can go to an Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary and discover a set of words based on a single phonetic that all relate to all those meanings. These are related words. And then most typically what happens is there's an additional word in that grouping of phonetic word values that isn't directly connected to what they saw in their dream. And very often that additional word points us to the intended meaning of the dream was. Or else we have glyphs used to write the words, where the glyphs tell us what the commonality of those different phonetic words are, and the glyphs point us to what the likely meaning of the dream was. And dreams are not incidental. That quite often in my own work, I've ended up with key pieces of information I would have never even thought of to research, and down to words I would never thought existed, that arrived because of a vivid dream, not because of initial research. And then I go out and follow. I've learned to follow up on that when that sort of thing happens. And very often a door opens to a whole other aspect of a thing I'm researching that I didn't know existed. So anciently, Hinduism associates dreams with one of these other states of consciousness that is not the equivalent of our waking state. It's an intermediate state between our state and the previous one, or maybe it's even a connection into the previous one. UFO contacts play out in terms of all those same phonetics that I've read hundreds of case studies by John Mack and Bud Hopkins of, where these are psychiatrists who interviewed people after UFO experiences. And the set of images that the person is describing that relate to the contact play out consistently in terms of these Egyptian word clusters, down to what color the UFO seemed to change when it moved away. Or, a good example is a woman steps out onto her porch and finds 3 gray aliens, but they're turned away from her. They don't know that she's there at first. And then they notice her and they quickly turn to leave, but she doesn't see 3 gray aliens leave. She sees 3 deer leave. The ancient Egyptian word that means to depart in haste also means deer. This overlap in meaning, where a common word defines both segments of what a UFO experiencer sees, implies, or what they feel, implies that there is a kind of a telepathic translation going on here, an interdomain translation, where an action that's being taken by the UFO participant, the UFO entity, is being translated across a boundary to the person who is experiencing it. For example, the idea of an owl is something that experiencers often report. They were looking at an owl, not an alien. But the Egyptian concept, the word that represents an owl, also represents the concept of trying to calm a person or trying to reassure them. So dreams and UFOs, from my point of view, are connected to the same energetic domain. And it looks to me like that's the domain just immediately preceding ours. As if you think of a progressive slowing of time to reach where we're at, in the domain where time runs 10 times as quickly as it does for us, that's the domain in which the UFO contacts seem to connect to and the dreams seem to connect to. And that makes sense in terms of Egyptian glyphs, because the symbol for the link between them and us is a gateway.
They tell you to follow your dreams, all the while your dreams are following you. There's a bumper sticker slogan for you. Put it on a t-shirt. That's fascinating, what you're talking about with these UFO and extraterrestrial experiencers, and how that relates to all the ancient language. Have you ever thought about writing a book about that?
I've thought about it. I'm friendly with a number of the top UFO researchers, so I felt like it was more to the point to pass that tidbit of information along to them, because they're more in a position to leverage it and to make use of it. It applies more directly to what they normally write about than what I do. But it's definitely a thing to be kept in mind, because by looking at things in that way, there's sense. There was a famous UFO incident in Midtown Manhattan, or not Midtown, but in Manhattan, on Manhattan Island, where there were multiple witnesses to the event. And at first, none of the witnesses really remembered very much about what happened. But then a couple of weeks later, each of these witnesses, with independently reporting to their psychiatrist without knowledge of each other, started to remember a piece of the story. And one of the pieces they remembered was they remembered seeing the woman who had been abducted by the alien spacecraft standing on a beach next to a river holding a dead fish. Well, in the Egyptian hieroglyphic language, the word that means dead fish also refers to the part of the story to be recalled.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. So I know you always have books in the work. So is there anything you're working on now or anything that's about to come out?
Yep. I'm just about to start the serious editing of a book called The Waters of Life, which the thrust of it is to trace how you get to biological life from the same dynamics of energy or same domain of energy that you start from to get to matter. So that'll hopefully be out by the end of the year. I have a second project I've been working on, which is to try to trace the meanings of the Egyptian glyphs in a derived way, so that each glyph is defined in terms of other glyphs that have been previously defined, and so end up with sort of a lexicon of hundreds of glyphs. So someone asks, how is it that you know that this glyph represents this thing? At very least, I have a document that I can cut and paste the pertinent pieces and send it to somebody and say, here's how you get to it, even though it might be complicated. So I expect that that'll turn into a book at some point. I fully expect that one of the next books will be to do the same thing, to trace energy to the dynamics of consciousness. But I have quite a bit of research left to do to tie all those pieces together. I know that they connect. I just need to be able to express how they connect. And I need to do it in scientifically reasonable ways. The Water of Life book is resting largely on the work of a woman named May Wan Ho, who was a biological engineer who recently passed away. But she did studies about something called coherent water. There's, in any body of water, you might think that water is a uniform thing, but it's not. It oscillates between two forms, and it oscillates so rapidly between the two forms that for decades they couldn't measure the oscillation. They didn't have a tool refined enough to measure the oscillation. And that dynamic of that oscillation ties into oscillations that happen all the way up and down the scale with energy.
So all those projects sounds like something that I definitely want to be looking forward to, as well as I know my listeners will. So where's the best place to find you and your work?
Okay. Google me and you'll find interviews and things like that I've done. My books are published through Inner Traditions, which is a subsidiary of Simon & Schuster. So there's an author page for me on simonandschuster.com. There's an author page on innertraditions.com. There's an author page on amazon.com. If they want to find me personally, the best way is to contact me through Facebook. I'm the only Laird Scranton on Facebook. If there's something more serious that needs to be discussed, I am not reluctant to give out my email address and try to conduct a discussion by email.
All righty. Well, this has been another amazing conversation, and I'm going to have to take another break because my brain muscles are in full flex mode, and I need brain massage at this point. But it's been so fascinating, and I love all the weird, wild places we went. And no matter how crazy the curveball I throw you, you always knock it out of the park. So thank you once again.
When I don't know, I just make stuff up.
Right, that's what you got to do. There's an art in bullshit as well, isn't there?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate our conversation, and I'll be happy to talk again at some point.
All right, great. Thank you. You take care, Laird.
Thanks.
Do you ever think about thought? What is it? Where does it come from, and where does it go? Is a thought conscious of itself? Do we think thoughts into existence, or is existence thinking through us? How many calls have gone unanswered? How many questions have you asked today? How do you know if you didn't think to think? Perhaps now is a time for puzzling, mulling, examining, considering, measuring, weighing, comparing, contrasting, connecting, and knowing knowledge more deeply than a passing thought flickering in and out of mind. There's more to thought than you think. There's more to know than you'll ever know. Perception is not often perceived, conceived, or received. Maybe try understanding by standing under the understanding of our elders and dreaming one vision at a time until all of the universe falls into place and into mind as a thought thinking itself into wisdom. Love, peace, happiness. Signing off. Deuces.